There's a character called the Tickler in A Clash of Kings, which is book 2 of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. The Tickler is a torturer for one of these armies that had recently conquered a new region, and his job was to determine where all the stuff was. Where's the gold? Where's the money? Where's the women? Are there any pockets of resistance? And of course, in the story, Arya, one of the main characters, has to be around this all the time, and she frequently thinks about this character, the Tickler. In one section, Arya thinks, quote, "The questions were always the same. Was there gold hidden in the village? Silver? Gems? Was there more food? Where was Lord Beric Dondarrion? Which of the village folk had aided him? Where did he go? How many men were with him? How many knights? How many bowmen? How many men at arms? How were they armed? How many were horsed? How many were wounded? What other enemy had they seen? How many? When? What banners did they fly? Where did they go? Was there gold hidden in the village? Silver? Gems? Where was Lord Beric Dondarrion? How many men were with him?" End quote. Now, as I learned more about how the Spanish administered the former Aztec Empire in what historians call the post-conquest period, I couldn't help but think about this quote from Arya about this character, the Tickler, in A Clash of Kings. Because in the period directly after the fall of Tenochtitlan, you now have the Spanish, who are aided by the Tlaxcalans, who are going to the other city-states and altepets and villages in central Mexico, and they're trying to assert control to make sure that the conquest is going to remain controllable and under wraps. They're setting up tribute systems. They are destroying and burning anyone who is still resisting. They're looking for the gold and the treasure so they can send it back to Spain or keep it for themselves. So I read you that quote about the fictional character, the Tickler, and now I'm going to read you a section from Camilla Townsend's book, Fifth Son. And you tell me which of those two passages sounds more like over-the-top, over-exaggerated fiction. Here's Camilla Townsend talking about the immediate post-conquest period. Quote, "The level of chaos in the early months of foreign governance was horrifying. The Spaniards were only able to maintain some semblance of order by ruling through the indigenous elites. In Mexico City, this meant ruling through Cuauhtémoc. He was kept in a locked room, and heated rods were applied to the soles of his feet when he claimed not to know where his forebears' stores of gold were held. If Tecuichpotzin, or Isabel, still a girl but rapidly growing into a woman, had ever feared her husband, she could only pity him now. The two of them heard that in the beautiful towns of Texcoco and Xochimilco, the Spaniards loosed their giant dogs and even let the mastiffs kill some of the men when the people there likewise denied knowing where the treasure hoards were. In altepet after altepet, the translator Malintzin was made to stand on a parapet and shout orders to bring the treasure. Then she had to watch the punishments meted out if the Spaniards judged that the orders were not obeyed. The conquerors seemed to be in a veritable frenzy to amass riches and generally please themselves. When not enough gold and jewels were forthcoming, they began to brand prisoners of war they had collected, undoubtedly including some of Smoking Shield's compatriots from the battle in Cuauhtémoc, and marched them to the coast for shipment to the Caribbean as slaves. In 1522, 1/5 of the profits of this venture, 5,397 pesos, as the meticulous records specified, were set aside as tribute for King Charles. The Spaniards kept the prettiest of the captive young women for themselves. Other starving girls whose families had been destroyed came to them voluntarily. In at least one case, a group of these girls was kept locked in a building in forced prostitution. Conscience-stricken observers of the treatment meted out to these girls told tales back in Spain. And in June of 1523, the king issued a plea to his people that they rein themselves in and cease their abuse of the native women. End quote. It seems that with no more political obstacles to stop the Spanish conquistadors, they were now free to get what they always wanted: gold, pleasure, riches, wealth, power. And if you were living through this, it would have been terrorizing. Loosing giant dogs on people, torturing leaders, killing and torturing common folk who don't know where the gold is, selling people into slavery, taking sex slaves, locking women in basements. Again, like Camilla Townsend says at the end of that quote there, things actually got so bad that the king of Spain had to issue a decree telling the Spanish conquistadors, hey guys, calm things down over there. You're making us look bad. And it's important to note that these things are all documented in not just the indigenous histories that are really revving up during this post-conquest period, but also in the Spanish records. So we know that this process was extensive, and we know that it was brutal. But aside from getting the things that maybe these Spanish conquistadors always wanted, gold, riches, glory, there's also some political motivations for what the Spanish are doing here. Again, aside from essentially looting the resources and people of these areas, the Spanish wanted to basically herd rural people into cities or larger towns so that they could tax, control, and even Christianize them. All part of this civilizing mission that we talked about in the last episode. According to the Spanish, civilized people lived together in cities, and they worshiped the Christian God. And they did things the way the Spanish back in Spain did them. And if you're seeing the irony of the Spanish appealing to concepts of civilization and Christianity while having their dogs literally eat the guts out of people while torturing them for the locations of gold and resources, then you're beginning to understand the hypocrisy at play, A, during this time period, but also B, in the way that these histories were written for a very long time. If priority 1 was the loot, then priority 2 was re-administering and controlling the remnants of the Aztec Empire. So Hernando Cortes essentially created what history calls the encomienda system, essentially dividing up the different parts of an altepet or a city-state and handing them out to his conquistador followers. This was essentially a reward for their work in this conquest. The Spanish conquistadors were to administer this land. They were to exact tribute from the people who now lived under their control. And they were expected to make an attempt to Christianize the people, again, that were now under their purview. Initial reports from the Spanish said that the conversion to Christianity was fairly instantaneous. We know now that this is not true. It's one thing to get conquered and give up your power to an invader, but as we know from history, sometimes it's another thing to give up your God or your religion. That's simply not what people do. And an example of this comes from a Mexica priest who is talking to one of these Spanish friars who's attempting conversion. And the Mexica priest says, quote, "It would be a fickle, foolish thing for us to destroy the most ancient laws and customs left by the first inhabitants of this land." Beware, lest the common people rise up against us if we were to tell them that the gods they have always understood to be such are not gods at all. All of us together feel that it is enough to have lost, enough that the reed mats, the thrones have been taken from us. As for our gods, we will die before giving up serving and worshiping them. This is our determination. Do with us what you will." End quote. The Spanish would have to find a more gradual attempt at converting the indigenous people. One thing they did was offer incentives. If you give us men for military service, or if you build a church in your community, and if you are receptive to our missionaries, then we will look on you with favor and maybe not burn your village down. But the emphasis is on maybe there, because hangings and executions due to religious matters absolutely happened. To make matters worse, you have to remember that there is a language barrier here, and the terminology for religious terms on the Mexica side and the Spanish side is not always going to perfectly add up. So when you're dealing with issues of divine stakes and cosmic significance, that makes a huge deal. So especially with the older generation of people who lived through the conquest, they were not so much receptive to Spanish Christianity. And what the Spanish were planning was they were going to focus on young people, not the elders who were steeped in tradition. Oftentimes, young Mexica boys were sent to religious schools to learn how to speak and write in the European way and learn how to be a good Christian. Then, of course, they would grow older, they would go back to their villages and their towns, and the process of that conversion would happen over years and decades. They would have children, they would bring them into the world of Christianity. And especially in the first 50 or so years after the conquest, there is always this tension between those who grow up in this way, embracing Christianity, and those who still embraced the old ways. Now, as Cortes is setting up this encomienda system, and as the Christianizing mission can begin after the Spanish victory, and as Spanish leaders are negotiating with different city-states and altepets around the Valley of Mexico, there's a bit of a sidebar story that happens in 1524, but it actually matters for the story as a whole. So Cortes had sent a group out to somewhere in Central America on a exploratory mission, but very similar to what Cortes and these conquistadors had done just a few years earlier. There are rumors that this exploratory mission has turned into these guys doing exactly to Central America what Cortes did to the Aztec, and establishing their own government in a sort of renegade style. So Cortes has to go deal with this. It looks bad for him. It undermines his authority. And it really threatens to poke a bunch of holes in his story of him trying to portray this all as, a humanitarian conquest that he had no choice but to do. If he's got people under him just conquering everything willy-nilly, that's going to look bad back in Spain. So the first thing Cortes does is he organizes a group of people to take down with him to Central America and deal with this threat. And of course, he takes Malintzin with him. And she was active and complicit in most of the high-level negotiations that were going on between Mexica leaders and the Spanish. She was there as people were tortured and forced to give up their gold, their riches, their food. So she was absolutely part of all of this, and she was not a helpless vessel. And to be honest, this is why many people still hate her today. But again, just like we talked about a few episodes ago, we might understand her motivations. And we might also understand that at this point, she ran her own household. She had established her own language business, which trained translators. She had become the ruler of her own encomienda at her birthplace. She had married a different guy than Cortes, a guy named Jaramillo, probably of her own choice. So she was an impressive figure, regardless of your thoughts on her. So Cortes takes Malintzin. He also takes Cuauhtemoc, who is the Aztec emperor at this point that Cortes had been keeping in chains. Along the way to Central America, Malinche gets to stop at her birthplace. In just a few years, the world, for her certainly, had been totally turned upside down. And you can imagine the feelings that she might have had. Some mixture of pride at having risen so high, shame for what her and the Spanish had done, nostalgia, maybe regret. But we don't know what she felt. Nobody decided to write it down. Camilla Townsend talks about this, saying, quote, "In a few days, Malintzin came face to face with her kin. It was an emotional greeting," Bernal Diaz later said. "The words she uttered are lost to us, as is so much of the indigenous experience of the immediate upheaval of conquest. We see this phenomenon everywhere in the history of the Americas. Sacagawea, for instance, another war captive who was traded away to white newcomers, would later meet her birth family as well on the overland trek with Lewis and Clark. No one recorded her feelings either, because she was pressed back into service as a translator for the travelers making their way to the Pacific. Letters and diaries sometimes bring us close to the grand moments or touching scenes in the history of Euro-Americans, but hearkening back to the thoughts and feelings of the less powerful, we meet only silence." End quote. At any rate, the trip to Central America goes haywire. Cortes is increasingly getting paranoid at this point. At a certain point, he thinks that the Aztec leader Cuauhtemoc is plotting against him. He tortures Cuauhtemoc and some of his friends. Malintzin is there at the torture session translating. Cortes hangs at least two of these friends and hangs Cuauhtemoc as well. There's a lot of debate about this period in Cortes's life. Was he going mad, or was this some sort of calculated effort to take this Aztec emperor away from Tenochtitlan and then get rid of him? Whatever the case, Cuauhtemoc is killed. Remember that this moment, in some ways, kind of signifies the Spanish asserting control, because with Moctezuma, Cortes was denying that he had any role in the killing of Moctezuma. But here, even though they're far away from Tenochtitlan, there's really no denying that Cortes did this. And it just shows that he now has the power and authority to simply kill the emperor of the Aztecs whenever he wants. Ultimately, the trip makes it to Central America. They find the guy that they were pursuing to be dead, killed by the people loyal to him, loyal to Cortes, and the whole trip was pointless. He's now out of food and money, so he sells a couple of local indigenous people into slavery to pay his way out of his problems, and then he goes back to Tenochtitlan. Cortes continues to patchwork alliances and marriages between Spanish and indigenous into this encomienda system. He takes in Moctezuma's daughter, Isabel, impregnates her almost immediately, and then he goes back to Spain with his son to smooth things over with the king. Malintzin, mother to one of Cortes's sons as well, would die in 1529. Despite the fact that Cortes was gone, the Spanish tribute system and their exertion of authority here was more overbearing than ever for the average people living in what was formerly the Aztec Empire. The tribute that the Spanish demanded of ordinary people was really tough. Camilla Townsend talks about one of these city-states, Quatinchan, saying, quote, "By the end of the decade, Quatinchan was committed to providing 24,000 woven blankets every 4 years, as well as 20 turkeys, 6,000 bushels of corn, 16 baskets of beans, 80 of chili, 16 of cha, and 16 of salt. In addition, 30 Indians had to provide domestic services to the encomendero and various Spanish officials. They could rotate that duty among themselves in any way they liked, as long as able-bodied workers presented themselves to the people at the right time. The tasks were growing more onerous than the town could handle, especially in the wake of so many deaths from the new diseases. It was becoming more and more difficult to plant and harvest their own crops, without which their children starved and became more vulnerable to disease." End quote. Again, you have to imagine trying to give those incredible numbers of tribute to the Spanish. You have to do it while the people in your town or village are dying from smallpox and other diseases. And you have to do it under the threat of violence. The Spanish would burn your village or torture your inhabitants, as we've already seen. And as the Mexica people are going through this and they're watching the Spanish assert authority and control, and they're establishing this new tribute and government, some are wondering long term, what's going to happen to the memory of our people? And so as they're learning these new writing systems for them that are based on a phonetic alphabet, they understand that if we can compile the history of the Mexica people, then it can be understood by everybody, and it can especially be understood by people in the future. And if we understand our past, then we will have a better opportunity to dictate our future. So this idea comes out of this historical time period, and a lot of the indigenous sources that we have about the Aztec Empire and the Mexica people, at least the histories that we can read, come from this period. Especially that younger generation of boys who had been trained in Christian reading and writing, and they could now write their own histories. And when reading these Mexica histories of their people, especially during this post-conquest period, we see a much more complicated picture than simply the Spanish coming in and taking everything over and asserting control. Because a big part of this is also, how did the Mexica people themselves and the Altepets or greater city-states and their leaders, how did they manage what the Spanish were asking of them? The impossible things that the Spanish were asking of them. How did they manage this new religion that was being forced on them? How did they balance this new culture with their old histories and how they themselves wanted to be viewed? So complex decisions of whether or not to pay tribute, whether or not to defy the Spanish, whether or not to engage in marriage alliances with the Spanish, whether to build a Christian church in your village or not, if and how many boys you were going to send to the friars to be trained in reading and writing. These were complex decisions that real people had to make, but again, always under the threat of duress. Because the Spanish version of the Tickler was never far away. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.